So I think we're going to get started. My name is Greta Schultz. I'm a senior here at Providence College, and on behalf of the Student Alumni Association, I want to welcome everyone to Family and Alumni Weekend. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Hackey. Dr. Hackey joined the faculty of the Health Policy and Management program here at Providence College in 1999 and was promoted to the rank of professor in 2002. He currently is the director of the HPM program here at PC, so we're very lucky to have him today speaking for us. And his principal areas of teaching and research include healthcare reform, hospital regulation, health planning and certificate of need regulation, and healthcare and popular culture. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Hackey.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm thrilled to be here, and I did not expect the turnout we've got. So I'm normally I like to move around a lot, but they've told me to be somewhat tethered here because of video here. So I will try to stay in this general vicinity so that we can keep things rolling. We have an ambitious topic here today, one which, frankly, is speculative. So no one really knows what the future of Obamacare is, but I'm going to do my best to shed some possibilities, light on some possibilities here. My opening slide really takes us to the first days of the Trump administration. This is President Donald Trump signing an executive order which orders federal agencies to try to basically relieve the regulatory burdens of the ACA, or AKA Obamacare. And so what we're going to try to understand is what that means and what does the future hold for us. So I want to start for everyone who's not an HPM major, and apparently looking out at the room here, about 50% of you are HPM majors or graduates of the program here. And so you must need a fix of some variety because they didn't get enough policy back in the day. So here we are, but this is the short and sweet history of where we started. Before we start thinking about the future of the ACA, we have to go back and see what it was supposed to do. And so there were several things we were hoping to have happen. The idea behind the Affordable Care Act was that we were going to require everyone to have health insurance coverage. So all Americans would have health insurance. We would accomplish that through an individual mandate, which you and I would have to purchase coverage or pay a penalty. And then employers, large employers, were also going to have to provide employees with coverage as well. And then we coupled that with reforms to the insurance marketplace. Before the Affordable Care Act, it was very difficult for many folks, particularly with pre-existing conditions, to get coverage. The ACA changes that, requires that folks provide coverage to people who are, basically sick and or have significant medical conditions. It also allows adult children to stay on their parents' plans up to the age of 26. And we also get rid of something that was very commonplace at the time, a lifetime cap on benefits, which again really affected the sickest members of the population. So folks with significant medical conditions would often hit a max, a cap on their lifetime payments. So these were changes to the insurance market. We're going to bring a lot of people into the insurance market. And then to couple the private side, we're going to also expand health insurance through both Medicaid, which is a program that has historically provided care for low-income Americans and people with disabilities. And also, we created these new health insurance marketplaces, which are supposed to stimulate competition, provide people with choices of competing plans, and really give us a lot more options. Now, we know that not everybody can afford coverage. And so one of the key elements of the Affordable Care Act were subsidies. We were going to help people who had lower incomes through middle income purchase coverage with subsidies to either purchase individual plans on the exchanges or states received enhanced funding to expand their Medicaid programs. And the idea was we would have more competition, more people would be insured, there would be less uncompensated care, and that the system would largely, if not achieve universal coverage, we'd get close to it. That was the promise. That was what we hoped would happen in 2010. It didn't. And now we have to understand what's going on, because the headlines, as I'm sure you've seen for several election cycles now, there's a lot of public dissatisfaction with the ACA, even though we have some significant accomplishments. This is not a popular plan. One of the things that strikes me as a political scientist studying healthcare reform, there's no real precedent for this. We've had unpopular bills before, but the public grew to accept them. Hard to imagine today in 2017, but people in 1965, 1966 talking about Medicare and Medicaid, really there was a lot of uncertainty there, and there was significant opposition to those programs when they passed. They passed by large margins, but a lot of folks, even hospitals, doctors, et cetera, had real concerns. But over time they melted away, and those programs became popular. The remarkable thing about the ACA is the extent to which the opposition has remained, first of all, and in some cases intensified. Yeah, it's an itch we continue to scratch, if you will. So why is that? Well, several things happened, and each of these things affects how people and stakeholders like insurance companies, hospitals, doctors, et cetera, look at this law. Well, the first big challenge is that millions of Americans chose not to buy coverage. And this was not supposed to happen. We had a mandate that you and I were both supposed to purchase coverage. The penalty, however, was low. And $95 in the first year. It has increased to $695 over time for an individual. But that penalty has always been far less than the cost of purchasing coverage for many folks who are middle or upper income. And so a lot of the folks we were hoping to bring into the pool never jumped in. And one of the problems that we have as a result of that is a concept called adverse selection. So it's basically a way of describing who signs up for coverage. Basically, people who sign up for coverage are people who really need coverage. They have medical conditions. They have a need for care. And many of the folks who do not anticipate a need for care have not signed up. And one of the big concerns for insurers as well is that the original idea was that we would have continuous coverage. The Obama administration wanted to make it possible for lots of folks to get into the pool. So one of the things they did was they held a number of these special enrollment periods that would allow people to jump in periodically. And that was a real problem from the insurance company's perspective, because the concern was that a lot of folks were waiting until they got sick to sign up. And if you wait till you get sick to sign up, then your health care costs are much greater than we would expect. And so remind yourselves, pinch yourselves about what the real goal of insurance is. Insurance is about pooling risk. We all contribute, and then when one or more of us get sick, we take money from that pool and help that individual. But the idea is that there's always a cross-subsidy between people who are healthy and people who are sick. This is what's wrong with the Affordable Care Act marketplaces in particular. They disproportionately attract sicker people, and the young, healthy folks, often referred to as, quote, the young invincibles, have not jumped in to the numbers we've hoped for. And what that means is our average cost is much higher. And you've seen that already. This was big news last year, a number of our largest insurers, and these are folks who've got decades of experience managing risk. These aren't newbies. Aetna, United Healthcare, Anthem, decided they're losing hundreds of millions of dollars. They can't compete in these marketplaces. Now, other markets seem to have attracted different players. There are some local firms that have been able to make money. Many of them have a background in managing Medicaid programs in the past. But these are some of our largest players. And if they can't make money, what has happened is that many of them have withdrawn. And so if you look around the U.S. right now, 1 out of 3 U.S. counties has only one participating Obamacare insurer. That's not competition. That's monopoly. And it's really hard to compete with yourself and say, self, okay, I'm going to compete. And then you turn to yourself and say, well, okay. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't happen. And so this is a real challenge for us. What we're seeing right now in a number of states, and Arizona, North Carolina, a number of states in the South are in this boat. As you have fewer insurers, what you end up with is the folks who are left in the market end up with all of the difficult risks. They lose money. As they lose money, what do? They raise premiums. As they raise premiums, it makes it even harder to persuade folks to jump into the market. This is what we call, in terms of insurance, a death spiral. As prices rise, only those folks who absolutely, completely believe they need insurance are going to jump in. And so that's a huge problem for us. And then the other key element here, and this dates back to the Supreme Court case, and this is where I'm going to give you truth in advertising here. When asked about the Supreme Court case back in 2012, this is the case that decided the future of the Affordable Care Act, I got it completely wrong. So you should take all of the things I'm going to tell you with somewhat of a grain of salt, because I thought back in the day that we would absolutely uphold the Medicaid expansion and that we would toss the individual mandate. Well, we tossed the Medicaid expansion and upheld the individual mandate. So you get what you pay for here, and I'm free. So that's it. This is the root of many of our current challenges. However, the Affordable Care Act promised to expand coverage largely using Medicaid, which I always thought was problematic for this reason. Medicaid is a program that's counter-cyclical. What I mean by that is it goes up in times when states are in financial distress because there are more people who qualify. There are more people who have low incomes. Medicaid is always a tough nut for states because they get money from the federal government, but they don't fully control their enrollment. And so when the economy tanks, as it did during the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, 2009, Medicaid rolls surge. But that's at the same time that state tax revenues are plummeting. So you're seeing two opposite trends here. Spending's going up, and then your revenue's going down. That's a problem. So states have kind of a love-hate relationship with Medicaid. And many states, when given the option, even though the federal government was going to pay in full for the first 3 years, and about 90% for the full cost of the expansion afterwards, states were leery. And many states chose not to adopt. And so what we end up with is only 32 states have expanded their Medicaid programs. Now, the cruel irony, of course, is that the states that didn't tend to have some of the highest rates of uninsured people in the U.S. States like Texas, Florida, a lot of the southern states that have, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. These are states that have a disproportionately high number of uninsured people. But they've not opted in. What does this mean? Well, it means that in practice, the promise we made hasn't been realized because the insurers agreed to all of those limitations on what they would do. I can't discriminate on the basis of pre-existing conditions. I got no lifetime caps. I've got all these new mandated benefits that we have to provide. These are good things for consumers, but they're expensive for insurers. They agreed to those conditions on the assumption that, quid pro quo, there would be essentially universal coverage, that we would not have a significant number of uninsured people. Hospitals, for example, used to receive these payments from Medicare for people who were uninsured. Well, those have been phased out. Why? Because we assumed that everyone was going to have insurance. So you don't need disproportionate share payments anymore. We're going to phase that out because now we're going to have all these folks who are able to come in with an insurance card. But that's not true. We've still got 30 million people uninsured. Now, the good news is we've insured 20 plus million people, which is good news. But the challenge is no one is really happy with what they've received at this juncture. The insurers are unhappy because in many cases they have not been fully paid for what they thought they were going to be paid for. The hospitals didn't receive universal coverage the way they thought they would. And many patients have found the coverage to be very expensive. And particularly if you are younger and healthier. So this is an interesting little snapshot of where we are. This is public opinion. And it's real hard to see back there. But I have, this is from the Kaiser Family Foundation. This is public opinion about the Affordable Care Act. And basically, we have three lines. We have a blue line, which is favorable. We have an orangey red line, which is unfavorable. And then we have a gray line, which is don't know and refused. Well, you can see that about 10 to 15% of the public remains clueless for the past 6 years. They don't know what they think about anything. So they just continue to be there at the bottom. And, shrug, we don't know. What is remarkable is the extent to which we've had relative stability here. If you look at this, in December 2016, we have I can't even read the darn thing. 46% of the public had an unfavorable view of the ACA, and 43% of the public had a favorable view. And we've fluctuated. The unfavorables have been as high as 53%. The favorables have been as high. The high water mark was the first year it passed, July, 50% of the public liked it. Contrast this with Medicare. Medicare is bedrock. It's the third rail of American politics. People are talking about changing Medicare in Congress now. Be wary, because the AARP and other interest groups are going to pounce on this, because this is a popular program. Most people like Medicare. Most people know someone who benefits from Medicare. And yet the remarkable thing here about the ACA is that despite the fact that we've brought 22 million people into the market, and you would think that would be a demonstrable policy success, a lot of folks do not like this law. And I think this is a real political problem, which is why the title of our talk today is The Future of Obamacare. This is unusual at the 7-year mark, and we're almost at the 7-year mark, to be talking about the future of a program that passed 7 years ago, and to have it still be such a contested issue. Now, when you ask Americans, and this is another question from the Kaiser Family Foundation asked in December, well, what should we do? You don't like it, we know that, but so now what? Well, the public is delightfully confused on this. 47% say we should not repeal it. And that should not come as a surprise, because 43% like it. Okay? 28% want to wait to repeal the thing until we know what we're going to replace it with. Almost a third. Seems reasonable. 20% want to repeal the thing immediately, toss it out, and then we'll figure out the details later. And then again, about 5% have no idea what we should do about anything. And so that's where we are. So if you look at the basic divide here, about half wants to replace, and about half wants to not replace, but there's no consensus as to how to proceed. And my friends, that's also true in Congress. This is a very complicated and convoluted issue that cuts in different ways. So let's talk a little bit about what we have here. What we have here is a brand new HHS secretary, the Health and Human Services secretary. This is now Tom Price. The thing you want to know about Tom Price is that Tom Price has been authoring legislation to repeal the ACA since 2010. So this is a slightly unusual administrative task. You've just appointed someone to head an agency who is an avowed foe of the agency's main programs. Okay? And this is a slightly different twist. And Price is a surgeon. He's an orthopedic surgeon. And he has been one of the more conservative members of Congress. And one of the reasons that his appointment is so significant is not that he can undo the ACA. He can't. But one of the remarkable things about the Affordable Care Act is the extent to which it delegates power to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. There are virtually scores of designations within the ACA that say, quote unquote, the Secretary shall. Well, when the Secretary was Sylvia Burwell, the Secretary shall take good care to make sure the law is faithfully executed, and will try to make sure it's successful. When the Secretary is someone who is avowedly opposed to the ACA, the Secretary shall probably do other things. And so one of the things that, and this has been a convoluted implementation process over the past many years. And one of the things I think is a really useful illustration of this. So you may remember fall of 2013 when we rolled out the Affordable Care Act and the website crashed. Bad days, okay? And then we brought a whole bunch of smart tech people in and they fixed the website and things got back on their feet, et cetera. As part of that process, the Obama administration basically exempted a lot of people from the mandate and the penalty. Now, in the tradition of no good deed ever goes unpunished, that set a precedent that one could waive the mandate and the penalty. So one of the first things that Tom Price could do, if he was so disposed, is to come in and say, this year, we're not going to enforce the mandate or the penalty. And so if that's the case, if you know that you're not going to be penalized for not buying insurance, and you're young and you're healthy, and you don't really feel like you need insurance, why would you go spend money on insurance that you don't need? Well, if that's the case, then the markets are going to be further distorted with fewer healthier people and more sick people, and you get basically this whole system starting to unravel. So he has a lot of influence. The same thing is true with Medicaid, by the way. Medicaid is a program that requires constant tinkering. Usually, these are typically done through waivers, and the federal government has to approve various waiver requests. Well, you can have a generous approach towards that, or you can have a very restrictive approach towards that. And so one of the things that we're going to wait to see what Secretary Price is going to do is to lay out his agenda here. But this is going to be a very interesting process. He's going to be a very significant person because he has obviously authored legislation to repeal, and I think folks in the administration are going to be looking up to him to come up with some type of a plan that will perhaps pass muster. That's going to be hard because the next point is, if we go back to these folks here, people who want to vote to repeal the law immediately, well, there's a group of folks in Congress who wants to do that. It's called the House Freedom Caucus. Okay, this is the really conservative element of the Republican Party. And many of these folks are members of the, quote, Tea Party. And so they campaigned on this. And the Tea Party has been known for kind of sticking to its guns. You know, they don't want half a loaf. They want the whole loaf. And so they say, we didn't come to Washington to repair the ACA. We didn't come to Washington to, kind of revise and reform the ACA. We came to get rid of it. And that's what we're proposing to do. Now, that's only about 40 representatives in the House. Mind you, that's a good chunk of people. House has got 435 members. Republicans have a nice majority in the House, but you take 40 of those folks out of the equation, and now it's a very iffy prospect as to whether you actually have a governing coalition. And so these folks are going to demand essentially as much of a repeal as they can get. Moderate Republicans, folks like Susan Collins from Maine, she's just introduced a very interesting proposal that would basically allow states to keep the ACA provisions if they want to, or to opt out if they want to, or to do some kind of a hybrid thing that might include medical savings accounts, et cetera, if they want to. But the key element is the states would have discretion. Okay? Now, this is a bill that's designed to appeal across the aisle. Attract Democratic support or attract Republican support. Have you been noticing any of the trends with the congressional votes on any of the Trump administration nominees recently? Bipartisanship is not exactly the watchword of Washington these days. So this is a very promising proposal in that you could potentially many states could keep their successful programs, and other states that wanted to move in a different direction could do so. It's unlikely that this is going to be a mainstream position either. So we ask, okay, what's the prospect here? Well, the first thing to remember is that outright repeal of the law in entirety, which is what many folks like Price and other Republican senators like Mike Lee from Utah have declared. I want to think about it, and some people have actually used this term. They've compared it to a cancer. They want to excise it. Go in, cut it out. That's easier said than done. The reason is, first of all, in the Senate, you need 60 votes to repeal the law in its entirety. Now, that's not a likely prospect. The filibuster is still alive and well on many issues. What we're likely to see, however, is a different process, a more technical process, one that a lot of folks aren't real familiar with, which is something called budget reconciliation. Budget bills cannot be filibustered. So even though you cannot necessarily take away all of the elements of the ACA, such as the expansion of health insurance for kids up to 26, pre-existing condition clauses, a lot of those things that changed non-monetary aspects of the healthcare system, you can defund them. And that's where reconciliation comes in. And this is what you may have seen earlier in the month if you were kind of keeping your finger on the ACA pulse here. The congressional budget committees have already put into place the process by which we will move through with reconciliation. And reconciliation bills can basically then be voted. You need a 51 vote majority. Now, you may lose a couple of people. We saw that. We saw that with the debate over the education secretary this past week. The vice president had to come in and break a tie, but you can still break a tie. You just have to keep enough people together to do it. But basically what would happen in this approach is you take all the money off the table. So all the subsidies to the consumers, all the subsidies to the states through expanded Medicaid, all the subsidies to insurance companies for the losses they have on those unhealthy patients that they didn't used to want to sign up, etc. As you take this money off the table, you make it much less likely that anyone wants to participate. Remember, there's no law that you have to participate in selling insurance in these marketplaces. And particularly if the money for the Medicaid expansion is scaled back, you're going to see it very difficult for states to sustain that. Because Medicaid, as you probably know, is a cooperative program. The whole premise of Medicaid is it's shared spending. States and the federal government share the cost, and there's a formula that determines that. Well, states could certainly expand, but that would be a budget buster. And this is a real challenge. So as we start to think here, it's unclear as to how we'll proceed. I think some move on reconciliation is likely. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not going out on a limb and saying, like I did in 2012, that the Supreme Court's going to do various things. That would be bad, because this apparently is being live streamed, and people everywhere will know it. And I'll have a lot of egg on my face. So I'm not going there, okay? But that, I think, is likely and possible. It is definitely possible in the House. Yeah, they have the votes to do that in the House. And I think that you could probably get something through in the Senate. So the problem is, we don't know what the timetable is. So if you listen to President Trump, and mind you, all these appointees have been delayed. So Price was supposed to be committed, confirmed, not committed, weeks ago. This is going to be good. I can see how this is playing on YouTube already. And so President Trump says we're going to be submitting the simultaneous bills to repeal and replace as soon as we have Price in office. Well, that hasn't happened yet. Mind you, he's just arrived in his office. He's trying to figure out where things are. But House Speaker Ryan says pretty much the same thing. We want to do the same thing, repeal and replace. That's the new mantra. So we're going to take away the old, and we're going to replace it with something new. Okay? But we don't have anything new yet. There's no consensus as to what the new thing's going to be. Now, people like Mike Lee, I mentioned him before, he is one of the more conservative members of the Senate, and he says we shouldn't do that. We should just get rid of this thing now. We'll worry about the replacement later. He says, I don't think we should allow it to go beyond that window, the repeal, because I think the American people are suffering. He wants to pull the plug. So here's the big problem. There's a whole bunch of people who dislike the ACA for various reasons. Those reasons are not all the same. You've got members of the Congressional Freedom Caucus who really hate it because of the individual mandate. They really don't like the idea of government mandating benefits. There's a whole bunch of people who don't like it on principle. There are other people who don't like it because they don't think it's worked particularly well at this juncture. It hasn't fully realized its potential. Premiums are rising, we haven't enrolled enough people, etc. There are other people who would like to keep parts of it, but not other parts of it. The problem is, you can't keep the things you like, such as the insurance market reforms that help pre-existing conditions and help kids stay on health insurance, but also raise the cost of the premiums and the policies that they are receiving without some compromise here. So if you keep only the things you like, which raise everybody's costs, this is not going to be sustainable. And so one of the big questions we have here is I could see potentially two paths to reform. And neither one of them is necessarily a clean path. One path is this: you blow the whole thing up. You literally, you press the button and boom. You can do this in a variety of ways, by the way. One way you blow this thing up is there's a lawsuit that the House of Representatives filed against the Obama administration, arguing that the Obama administration had exceeded its authority, spent money that Congress hadn't appropriated to provide payments to insurers, and basically the argument is the Trump administration could refuse to defend the lawsuit. And the lower courts have already ruled against the Obama administration. So if you refuse to defend the lawsuit, then the payments to the insurers stop. Payments to the insurers stop, then more insurers are going to say, we're out. We can't afford to lose money. Aetna, and other companies are saying, well, we're losing millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. We can't do this. So we need those payments. Now, just yesterday, and this is the problem with healthcare and health policy these days, literally, I mean, the sand is shifting under our feet. Yesterday, federal judge in a case filed in Oregon by an Oregon insurer basically argued that the federal government actually owed insurers hundreds of millions of dollars in what we call risk corridor payments. These, again, are payments designed to compensate insurers for losses. And the federal government hasn't paid them. And so if this case is upheld, and we don't know if it is going to be, because there's another case that was decided in a different jurisdiction that said they wouldn't be. But if it is, the federal government could be on the hook for like $8 billion in payments that they have not made. And the insurers are very unhappy about this. I mean, think of how you'd feel if you were owed $8 billion. I wouldn't be happy either. Okay? And by the way, there was an implicit promise that you would be paid the $8 billion. And yet, here's the kicker. The real element here is not the courts, it's Congress. Because Congress controls the purse strings. And if Congress doesn't appropriate the money, even if there's a judgment against the federal government, Congress must still appropriate money before the Treasury can issue a check. And if the Treasury is not authorized by Congress to do that, there is no payment. I have a hard time envisioning any scenario under which the current Republican Congress would appropriate funds to bail out insurers who participated in the Affordable Care Act. And so this is going to be a dicey situation. Now, many people are saying, okay, if this happens, if we blow the system up, millions of people are going to lose coverage. And that is ultimately true, but it won't happen overnight. And so this is, as you start to hear conversations about repeal and delay or repeal and repair, because now we've got all sorts of different permutations floating on or out there, this is what they mean. Basically, if we repeal it now and we set a date for when it goes away in the future, a sunset clause, basically sometime in 2018, it seems to be a top popular year, then people will ultimately lose coverage if they are covered now through these various expansions and health insurance exchanges, et cetera, but they would have a time period where they could adjust and find new coverage. So it's not as if we flick the switch and all of a sudden 20 million people are overnight uninsured. But that does require a plan. And there is no consensus on a plan right now. Like I said, lots of people don't like it. Lots of people would like to see it go away. But there is no consensus as to what to replace it with. And by the way, given the current context in Washington, I would be stunned if there was any type of bipartisan collaboration on this. So basically, the political problem is this. You're going to need each and every Republican to sign on to that plan. Yeah, and many people, I don't claim credit for this one, but many people have compared this to the dog that catches the bus and then doesn't know quite what to do. Because you spent your whole life chasing that bus, and it was the target of all your energies, and now you're there, I got the bus. Now what? And actually now, as some people have said, the dog is driving the bus. And so it's even more confusing. Okay, so this is a real challenge. Now, this creates a big political problem for Republicans in states that have expanded Medicaid. And I'm thinking of states like Ohio, for example. John Kasich ran for president. His state was one of the states that expanded Medicaid. Hundreds of thousands of people in Ohio got coverage through this plan. It's really tough as a Republican governor or as a Republican legislator to go back and say, yeah, we're taking that away. And oh, by the way, I'll be running for re-election next year. So one of the political dynamics here is a time pressure. We're operating in a sense of political time. One of the questions is, what can we do this year? You know how divisive the Affordable Care Act was in 2010. One of the reasons, it was an election year. Americans tend to have relatively short memories on some of these things, but when it comes to an election year and you talk about anything involving raising taxes, increasing fees, new regulations, et cetera, that's a tough sell. So politically speaking, I think the best prospect for any action is 2017, and sooner rather than later. And that's why when you see someone like Mike Lee say, we got to do this now, we want to do this by Easter, that's why. It's the first 100 days that everyone's saying, okay, chop, chop, let's go. Because as time goes on, you lose momentum. Now, some folks have argued, and I'm not sure what I think about this, that if you just blow the thing up, you'll force people to compromise because the system will be essentially unstable. You essentially manufacture a crisis. That's assuming a level of rationality which may or may not exist in Washington. I don't know. You could do it, but you may have a different scenario where you blow it up and everybody just says, I'm out. And the Democrats will say, okay, you own it. Yeah, it's yours. I can't imagine a whole lot of bipartisan collaboration on this. So the alternative is we try to proceed by coming up with a replacement plan. Well, the political time element that I just mentioned is a problem here. Because unless you've got a viable replacement plan like now, then it's going to take time to develop one. And that was one of the lessons of Bill Clinton's efforts to reform the healthcare system back in the 90s. You may remember the task force that Hillary chaired. It took several months of hearings, et cetera, to develop a plan. And the president didn't really even introduce a plan until the fall of his first year in office. And by the time the plan's getting some airplay in Congress, we're in election mode and trying to decide on a really tough domestic policy issue in an election season is not easy. So even though it may make more sense to come up with a replacement, politically, it could be very difficult to pass anything at that late juncture. Now, there's another option, and I mentioned this bill before, the bill by Susan Collins and Bill Cassidy. We could essentially allow states to take a lead role here. Some states are very satisfied with their implementation of the ACA. Massachusetts comes to mind, for example, generally regarded as having a very successful implementation. And states like Massachusetts, if given an option, could continue to participate. And other states that were unhappy could opt out, but we would allow state discretion. This decentralized approach would allow some variation, and that's good and bad. One of the advantages of the ACA is that it's kind of leveled the playing field across the country. One of the disadvantages of the ACA is that it has conformity, and a lot of states feel hamstrung. So this is a challenge. Pardon me. Bigger issue. We need to make some decisions soon, because those private insurers that we've been mentioning, they need to know what to do. They have to set their rates and decide whether or not to participate in next year's marketplaces, if there are going to be next year's marketplaces, this spring. And the clock is ticking here. And so one of the things that we are struggling with here is if I don't know what's going to happen with subsidies for individuals, I don't know what's going to happen for subsidies for insurers, I don't know what the contours of the marketplace are going to look like, then it's very difficult for a lot of those insurers to decide that that's a good business risk. You have to make, from the perspective of the insurance industry, you have to make a business case for healthcare reform. You have to decide that this is worth participating. And particularly in companies like Aetna, United Healthcare, other companies that are for-profit entities, they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders. They can't just go off and do something that they're going to lose lots of money on just because they think it's a nice thing. They'll be tarred and feathered at the next annual meeting. And so that's a huge problem. I mentioned the lawsuit here. I think one of the things that you're going to see the Trump administration doing is waiving a lot of the requirements that have affected businesses and individuals where possible. And that is potentially problematic because it basically takes the teeth out of the law, and presses the pause button. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was things like the special enrollment periods are a real concern for insurers. A lot of folks felt that those periods generated a much sicker risk pool than other periods during the regular enrollment period. So one thing you could do is simply not have those. So there are special enrollment periods. They don't have to happen. The administration previously had allowed them to happen, but there's no requirement that you do it and what frequency you do it. And so this is a big question for us. Now, I want to wrap up with a little shout out here. I see a couple of my former students who've participated in a couple of these projects here, and we have some remarkable students in health policy at PC who have really been wonderful collaborators in research. This is a piece I co-authored with Erica May, who's conveniently located in row 2 over here. And this is something I think that is very relevant for us as we go forward because state experiences with the Affordable Care Act vary. And so on the one level, I think a more measured approach would be to allow states to have more input and more control. And doing so would allow states that have had successful experiences to continue those, and also to allow states that have not necessarily had as successful experiences to then learn from the states that did. We need to figure out, rather than simply throwing out the baby with the bathwater, we need to figure out what's working and what's not working. I think that's one of the dangers of a straight repeal. There are a lot of things that are positive that are happening in insurance markets around the US. There are a lot of things that aren't positive happening in insurance markets around the US. The key for us in terms of making better policy is to sort through them and to figure out what's what. So to not just use a broad brush and say, well, the whole thing's got to go, but rather to say, well, wait a minute, what things seem to be working? And why is it that this is working well in this state and not in other states? So Erica and I authored a piece for the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 2015 that tried to measure the performances of those state health insurance marketplaces. And I think it's really important to try to understand what's actually happening at the ground level. And then we also worked on another piece for a local policy think tank here in Rhode Island called the Collaborative that would create a report card. Kind of formalizing the initial effort we had made. And this just uses one of the indicators we measured, and this is enrollment growth. And it's really hard to see from where you are, but basically if you see the little states in blue, those are states that saw significantly higher enrollment growth. And if you see states in red, their actual enrollment growth declined. And then gray is like a modest increase, under 20%. And as you move through various gradations of green, you'll see that some states are doing far better than others. Well, the basic idea behind the ACA was to increase access to health insurance. So just looking at the map, one of the things you can see immediately is there's substantial variation. And so as a policymaker, one of the things I'd want to know is, okay, what's happening in Massachusetts compared to what's happening in New York? What's happening, in South Carolina versus Georgia? I want to know, for states that are using similar approaches, why some are working well and some aren't. That's an important lesson for us. And I think if we jump right in and simply press the undo button, then we're going to have a potential problem here because we're going to lose a lot of those really good lessons that we should learn from. Now, I want to wrap up. This is my final slide. I want to hopefully have some time for questions here. One caveat. And that is, as we move to decentralize, one thing you should keep in mind is the current American political landscape. Okay? And you know that the last presidential election was a tight race. President Trump won in the Electoral College. We know he lost the popular vote. There's a different story playing out at the state level. And a lot of us here in New England don't necessarily have a sense of how this is playing out nationally. The states in red are Republican majority. They are trifectas. Republican House, Senate, and governorship. Okay? And then we have the Democratic states. They're in blue. Okay? Dark blue. And then you have a few states that are divided. Well, here's the reality, the political reality. If you decentralize, a lot of these states are unlikely to continue the path that we have been on with healthcare reform. These are states, in many cases, that were strongly opposed. They did not expand Medicaid. They did not set up their own health insurance marketplaces. They did not embrace the ACA in any way, shape, or form. And one of the remarkable things that has happened over the course of the past 8 years is the extent to which the Democratic Party has lost seats across the country at the state level. They have lost governorships. They have lost seats in both houses. They have lost a lot of ground. And what that means is, at this point, Republicans are driving the bus in most of these states in terms of what we're going to see for the future of health policy. So to the extent to which you decentralize those decisions, that's not a politically neutral decision. So that's a really interesting thing to watch in the coming days and weeks as we see this unfold. I will not leave you with a crystal ball prediction because, frankly, I haven't the foggiest. And what I'm trying to do is to stay abreast of the late-breaking developments and who said what to who now, and understand the shifting sands here. I think that the takeaway message I would leave you with is that right now we have no consensus. There is no clear path forward for the Republican majority. There's a clear path forward for the Democratic minority. No. They do not want to be part of a system that would undo kind of President Obama's signature Democratic achievement. And having said that, many of them recognize the system needs fixing. There are a few folks, even President Obama, in a recent piece that he wrote for a medical journal, argued that the law needs fixing. It could use repair. Repair, however, suggests we can decide on what to fix. When you take your car into the mechanic, you generally have a sense of what needs to be fixed and some marching orders there. Right now, we don't really have that. So with that, I'm going to pause and kick things over to you. And if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. I'm going to repeat them for the folks in the back here in case anybody can't hear. But with no further ado, anybody has a question, I'd be more than happy to entertain any and all comers here. Yeah, my friend.
Why wasn't the penalty for not enrolling, initially when this was rolled out, why wasn't that penalty the same cost as it would have been to buy insurance to force everyone into the system?
Well, you ask, the question was, why wasn't the penalty higher, kind of equivalent to the cost of insurance when we set this design up? That is the question that the insurance industry has asked. That was what they had hoped would happen. So essentially you would be given a choice of, okay, buying insurance and having something, and not buying insurance and basically having nothing, and still having to pay the same amount. Many folks in the administration felt that it was important to phase this in. They didn't want it to be too punitive, particularly for folks who were either lower income or folks who were self-employed, et cetera. So there were lots of hardship exemptions and lots of flexibility built in there. But the penalty, I think everyone looking back, 2020, hindsight, says the penalty was way too low. And it was never, and the time to get folks into those markets really was 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. That would be the opportunity to kind of build the new expectation. It didn't happen. And so I think that was a tremendously missed opportunity, which has had big consequences for us. Yeah, it's a really important question. Insurers wanted a higher penalty from day one. And there was a lot of pushback, a lot of folks within the administration. There's a wonderful book by Steve Brill, by the way, called America's Bitter Pill, which I highly recommend if anyone is interested in the history of healthcare reform over the past few years. It's a great read. It kind of reads like a novel. And there was a lot of back and forth infighting within the administration about how tough to be on insurers and how if you will, generous to be in terms of consumers. And what we ended up with was a compromise, and the compromise didn't work real well. That's a good question. Yeah?
So if Hillary won, what do you think, what would the steps that she would have taken to fix the system be? And in your opinion, do you think she had a clear shot at fixing it?
That's a great question. So if Hillary won, what would she be doing to try to fix it, and then would she have a chance of doing it? Let me tackle the second question first. No, I don't think she would have had much prospect for fixing it, simply because Republicans have a solid majority in both houses of Congress, and obviously you can't fix the darn thing solo. So I think you would have seen a continuation of the past several years of kind of no votes from the Republican Party. The Republican Party did not want to fix this. If she were to be in office, I think what she would have tried to do was to take some steps to stabilize the insurance marketplaces. I think there are lots of things you can do on that front. One of the things that we can do and can think about is limiting some of the mandates on insurers, so giving them more flexibility to customize products. Right now we have a very, very clear set of mandates in terms of what minimum essential benefits are. You can loosen some of those, and that would make some products more affordable and accessible, particularly for folks who are healthier. I think one of the big challenges is the future of Medicaid. And it's interesting, by the way, Mike Pence from Indiana, his former Secretary of Health and Human Services, who ran the Medicaid program in Indiana, is now going to be running CMS. And the Indiana program is an example of what we call a private Medicaid expansion, where basically you use federal funds to help people purchase private policies. I see one of my other collaborators here, Danny Waldron, and we looked at the state of New Hampshire in a report for the ACA Implementation Research Network, and New Hampshire followed a similar model. And so I think Pence may be someone who is inclined to not just get rid of everything, but perhaps move in a more conservative direction that is consistent with kind of free market principles. And Republicans have signed off in a number of states. Arkansas, for example, is another state that has implemented this, where basically instead of getting money for Medicaid and using it to expand the public program, you get the money for Medicaid and you basically give folks what amounts to a voucher to help them purchase private policies, which is much more consistent with where the Republican Party has been. I think Hillary would have had her work cut out for her if she were to try to build some kind of consensus to fix what was wrong. So this is one of the things that is so difficult here is this entire process is so politicized. And not that we should be surprised that politics is a big thing in Washington, but with a program like this, as complex as it is, you need folks to look beyond just the political divisions in some cases and find common ground that has some policy sense. There are lots of folks who I think would be willing to do that. I don't think there's a majority of folks at this point who are willing to do that. And so that leaves us in a pickle because we need folks to think pragmatically, not politically. And I think, unfortunately, really what we've been in is a continuing cycle of thinking politically first and pragmatically second. And that's not going to lead us to productive solutions. Other questions? Yeah, my friend in the back.
Taking into consideration that last map you showed, depicting such Republican dominance on a statewide level, do you really think it'll be that much of a political liability to the Republicans at the midterm elections if they don't make any major changes in the ACA?
That's a great question. The question is, would it be a political liability for Republicans if they don't make major changes for the ACA? I think that depends on which states. So, for example, if you're Susan Collins from Maine, I don't think it's a political liability at all. You know, you go back to your folks and you say, hey, I tried to come up with a reasonable, crafted approach to have a repeal and replace, and we just didn't get it done. If you're a Tea Party Republican, member of the House Freedom Caucus, and you went to Washington and you said, we were going to get this thing done, and now you've got what you all campaigned for, you've got the presidency in both houses of Congress, and you come back empty-handed, I think a lot of those folks are really wary of going back with nothing. At the same time, and to your point, this is where this cuts both ways. Because states with Republican governors where we've had a lot, and Kentucky is a classic example of this, by the way. Kentucky's had one of the largest proportional decreases in the number of uninsured people in the country. And they now have a Republican governor who's viscerally opposed to the ACA. And so he's kind of between a rock and a hard place because a whole bunch of his citizens have benefited from the policy that he's fundamentally opposed to. So do you put principle before politics? And that's going to be very interesting to see because, I mean, you could literally, you could cease to participate in some of these expansions, but that has direct and immediate consequences for a lot of the folks who voted for you. And this is going to be a really big issue in the 2018 midterm elections. You want to look particularly, by the way, at the states which Donald Trump carried, where there are Democratic legislators, particularly senators, running for re-election. 2018 is going to be a very big year, by the way. A lot more Democrats on the ballot in 2018 for the Senate than Republicans. So they have a lot more turf to defend. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on those folks to make sure that they're reading the tea leaves and figuring out what happened in 2016. But it's a very dicey scenario because in some cases, fulfilling your campaign promises can have direct and immediate consequences for your voters. So I think that's a really difficult scenario for us. Anybody else? I think we got time for one or two more questions. Yeah, my friend.
You talked about the competition,
Yep.
is less. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, I'll get the numbers wrong, but the federal government created about, 30 or so, 32 nonprofit
Yes.
insurance companies. And most of them went bankrupt.
Belly up.
There's about 8 left or something
Yep.
like that, and those 8 are heading in the wrong direction.
Yep.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the co-ops were a disaster.
Yeah.
I think there's no other, you can't put a happy face on it. The idea was that we would create these new insurance companies, health insurance cooperatives that would be nonprofit. They would kind of invigorate local insurance markets. They, for the most part, did a terrible job estimating risk. They didn't manage their expenses well. And as you said, most of them have gone belly up. And so I think that's a cautionary tale for the federal government as a venture capitalist. Just to be frank, and I think one of the things about the insurance markets is that it's very difficult, particularly under the shifting sands of mandates that aren't particularly well enforced or don't have a lot of penalties. Folks thought that there would be more people jumping into the pool than there were. And they thought it would be easier to market to those folks with affordable options. It has proven very difficult. And I think that's true for a lot of folks. When you look at this is a bigger issue, but this is a big problem with the current policies we have. Many of the ACA plans, your so-called bronze and silver plans, have a very, very high deductibles. So you get a relatively cheap plan that is paid for via subsidies, but the deductible, when you actually are at point of service and you have to go get care, is often substantial. And so that becomes a huge problem because people then look back and say, wait a minute, this is not what I thought. I thought I was insured. And you look at some bronze market plans, you got a $5,700 deductible, you're not feeling too insured. At that juncture. And so I think a lot of the public did not fully understand how to purchase. And so that went in. And you see that with the continuing need for navigators and other folks to help people buy products in this marketplace. A lot of folks struggle to figure out the terminology. They don't know the difference between the copay and the coinsurance and the deductible and all of this stuff. And so in many cases, unfortunately, they buy the wrong plan. And particularly if you're someone with ongoing medical needs, if you've got diabetes, you've got hypertension, you've got something that requires ongoing medication and follow-up and treatment, if you buy a high deductible plan, you're basically signing up for ongoing medical expenses you didn't know. To your point on the co-ops, I'm not sure we created the co-ops in the right places. In some cases, some states which already had kind of robust markets, we created co-ops, and they're a brand new player, and so I'm not really surprised that they didn't really gain a lot of traction. And some of the other markets that probably could have used a co-op, we didn't have one. And so I think again that wasn't the best planning, but clearly not the optimal scenario in terms of what we hoped to happen. That was designed to be a pro-competitive measure, and it was not a success. One last question. Yes, my friend.
My question is about, we heard when it was rolling out about Cadillac plans that they were going to get hit, and then we know Obama extended them, but I don't think he waived it. Is that a big thing that's moving that we talked about?
Well, that could be that the Cadillac tax, and the Cadillac tax is on health plans that provide unusually generous benefits. One of the things that is a consequence of that, that has been expended. But many companies have already kind of responded to this proactively by either raising deductibles or kind of scaling back the cost of their benefit plans to try to maintain a position before the Cadillac tax kicks in. A lot of Republicans would like to see that go. A lot of Republicans would like to see the tax on medical devices go. A lot of Republicans would like to see that a lot of the taxes on insurance companies go. So there's a lot of support for a lot of those tax repeals. But here's again the borrowing from Peter and paying Paul element. All of the benefits from the ACA depend on a revenue stream from somewhere. So if you start taking away all of the things that provide the money that you don't like, and you still want to provide the benefits, that's an unsustainable scenario. My message for everybody here this morning is that we have no solutions. We have no idea what's really going to happen, but it's going to be a wild ride, and I encourage you to keep your eyes peeled and make sure you kind of follow this debate, because I think it's going to be very consequential for us. Thank you so much for your time this morning. And I think there's a wonderful person back there who will steer